YouTube? So this is going to be the final video for my Colt Revolver vintage line. Today we're going to talk about the Colt Cobra. Well, that was the original idea. After realizing that the Colt Cobra is nothing more than just a lightweight version of the Colt Detective Special, that would be an incredibly short video. So instead, I thought we'll just talk about the Colt D-frame line, particularly on their Snubnose revolver models. Now, I understand that Colt has more duty-sized weapons for the D-frame, such as the Colt Police Positive Special. There's the Colt Courier, Colt Viper, and the Colt Diamondback. But for here, we're just going to focus on the Snubnose revolver models. Now, when talking about Colt's Snubnose revolver line, much of the credit really has to come from John Fitzgerald, who was an employee of Colt, and also the Police Positive Special, which was a 4-inch barrel gun of the D-frame size. Now, what John did was that he modified his own Police Positive Special, and it became the archetype for Snubnose revolvers that we know today. Some of these modifications is that he shortened the barrel and the ejector rod on a Police Positive Special, which would have been a 4-inch barrel, so he shortened that to 2 inches. He also bobbed the hammer so that it would act as a double action only type of a weapon. He rounded the grip frame, which was a little bit more sharp edge, square sharp edge on the Police Positive Special. And he also removed the front part of the trigger guard. And that would become known as the Fitz Special. As you can imagine, Colt took notice of this and they liked John's idea, so much so that they decided to release their own line in vein of the Fitz Special. Colt's version would be named the Colt Detective Special, and it had pretty much the same modifications that John Fitzgerald had done to his Police Positive Special 38. Except for removing the front part of the trigger guard and bobbing the hammer. The Colt Detective Special was introduced in 1927, and it would run to, I think, about 1996. And that firearm would have been available in 38 Special, 38 Colt New Police, and 32 Colt New Police. Now the first, what I would say, gen or model of the Colt Detective Special ran from 1927 to 1946, and some of its features was that its ejector rod was actually shorter than you see on this Colt Cobra. The front sight was kind of rounded, kind of like a half moon front sight like you see on old cowboy guns, and then the cylinder latch and the hammer were checkered, and then of course the grip frame was rounded. Because remember that this idea came from the Police Positive Special, and I think that gun was only available in a square inch or a square grip frame. The second model of Colt Detective Specials ran from about 1947 to maybe 1972, and those changes were that the ejector rod was the same length as the barrel now, so it wasn't shorter like it was in the first gens. The cylinder latch is more smooth, it wasn't checkered. And then the hammer and the trigger, I believe, maybe it was the trigger and the front sight were serrated, like this actually. The front sight for the second gen Colt Special was just like this. It wasn't a round half moon sight. Also in 1965, Colt had standardized its D-frame line. Now I don't know if they did it to the 4-inch barrel guns, but what they did to the Snubnoses is that they shortened the grip frame. Well, this isn't a good example, but they shortened the grip frame even shorter, and so the grip that you put on the gun, it would take up space on the bottom. And they did that on the Colt Detective Special and the Colt Cobra just to kind of standardize that line, because around the same time they'd released the Colt Agent, which was very similar to the Colt Cobra and Detective Special, except that the grip frame was shorter. And so rather than make two different grip frame sizes for the same gun, essentially, they just kind of standardized it and made the Colt Cobra and the Detective Special all have that sort of shorter grip frame. The third model of the Colt Detective Special ran from 1973 to maybe 1986, and the difference there was that the the gun had a shrouded ejector rod. So you notice how there's nothing really protecting this ejector rod. It actually had an ejector rod shroud, I guess you call it, and the idea was to protect the ejector rod. It had a full ramp front sight and oversized wood grips, but I mean, it was certainly a distinct visual difference, but pretty much the same gun, really. Now, as I mentioned, this gun is an actual Colt Cobra. I wish I knew what the year was. I've been trying to call Colt for the last 3 days. Their archives, but I guess I don't know. I think they're on vacation. So I don't know what year this gun is. Be pretty funny if it was 1966, though, right? Actually, no, I don't think it's 1966. The Colt Cobra had two models. The first model looks like this, and the second model it just has an ejector rod. That's it. That's the only difference. And its calibers were exactly the same as the Colt Detective Special. You can get it in 38 Special, 38 New Colt Police, and 32 New Colt Police. You could also get it in 22 LR. So that's a new one. As mentioned previously, the Colt Cobra is the exact same gun as the Detective Special. The only difference is that it has an aluminum frame instead of a steel frame, which means it weighs less. And you might be wondering, is the weight really that much of a difference? If you consider extreme circumstances, like you go hunting, right, and you got your rifle or your shotgun, if the gun is really heavy, you really don't want to be carrying that for hours in the field, right? Now, not to say that all the weight is bad. Yeah, when you go to the firing range, that weight does help reduce recoil. But as you can imagine, different scenarios, different reasons you'd want a little bit more of one thing, a little bit less of one thing. And the Colt Cobra, as far as I can tell, is quite popular. I think people really are drawn to the fact that the gun weighs less. I mean, I can't imagine a Detective Special weighing much more, but, the less weight makes you forget that it's there, and that's pretty important to a lot of people. If something's really just dragging you down on your hip, depending on how you carry the gun, it really makes you reconsider if it's going to be your main carry weapon. The Colt Cobra line ran from 1950 to 1981, and as I said, this is your first model, first gen. This is what it looked like. The weight was 0.94 pounds. It can have a full grip frame like this does here. Like I said, in 1965, this also was shortened to match the grip frame length of the Colt Agent. So clearly this gun is made before 1965. But yeah, that's pretty much it. This is one of the two models you can get in the Colt Cobra. Now, the second model of Colt Cobra looks exactly like this, except it has an ejector rod shroud, which makes it weigh 1 pound. That's all the weight that comes from it. And that's pretty much it. I'm not aware of any other difference in the Colt Cobra line Gen 1 or 2 in the fact that the second one just has an ejector rod shroud. Now we've pretty much covered the main Snubnose revolver line for Colt, at least the most popular versions. However, there are some outliers, interesting things that Colt has tried to do before, about the same time as the release of the Colt Cobra and Detective Special, and I would like to talk about those as well. So the first one is called the Colt Air Crewman. Now, this revolver is pretty interesting. It has an aluminum cylinder, not steel like the Cobra or Detective Special. And the idea is that with that, aluminum cylinder, it was a very light gun, probably lighter than this actually. And of course, it was intended for air crewmen. It was made in 1951, so pretty close to the release of the Colt Cobra itself. And people liked it. I think the Air Force liked it. Everybody loved it. Problem though, within 2 years, it had many reports of failures. as you can imagine, the cylinder is a key part of the revolver. It's really got to be strong, probably about as strong as the forcing cone, the frame. It's a part that you really cannot skip out on strength. And of course, lots of things were done. Colt actually tried to make special ammunition for the gun specifically. I'm not a fan of that, but that was one solution they tried. That didn't help. And what's interesting too is that Colt's rival, which I think we all know is Smith & Wesson, also had kind of the same idea that Colt did, releasing a revolver with an aluminum cylinder. I believe Smith called theirs the Model 12, and just like the Air Crewman, it was having cylinder issues, cylinder failures within 2 years of service. As you can imagine, that gun was discontinued quite quickly, actually. It would appear that aluminum cylinders don't handle the pressure of .38 Special very well. Now, if you look on Smith's website, you'll kind of see the innovation, and I appreciate the innovation. There was a gun on there that I saw, it said it had a titanium cylinder. And, you think titanium sounds pretty strong, right? And there's a warning on there. It says that you can't use bullet grains less than 120. Now, when I say grains, or if you hear people talk about grains for bullet weights, typically, all things being equal, a bullet that has a lighter weight in the grain means that it's gonna have a lot more velocity. Did I talk about this before? I think I talked about this with like the Model 19. That was something to where there were issues with the forcing cone, with the fact that 357 in terms of velocity that we know, the standard we consider is 158 grain. If you're going to go from 158 to 125, which I have called lightning rounds before, that's a lot more velocity than the research that was done. The research was done with 158. If you're going to put a lighter bullet in there, there's going to be more force, more velocity, right? And it can cause damage, and it has caused damage, in our history. You can see an example of a cracked forcing cone on a Model 19, or you can hear a lot of stories about people's pythons going out of time because they're running what I call the 125 lightning rounds. Now, going back to the titanium cylinder, I appreciate innovation. Somebody had to make a terrible spear before we got the best spear. Somebody had to make a terrible sword until we got the best sword. And granted, we might already have the best snub-nose revolver, but the titanium cylinder, I guess that Smith was going with, was that it would weigh less, which again means that people will carry something. You will carry something that doesn't weigh a ton, but people will see issues with the titanium cylinders kind of melting or not really holding up. Now, granted, yes, Smith does say don't use bullet weights lighter than 120, but it kind of says something if we're going to use a weapon in terms of standardization, and we understand that's going to work for when we need it. Do we really need to add on things like don't use this, use with that, don't use that, use with this? Innovation is great, but I think it would be wise to stick to industry standard. Now, the last firearm we have to talk about, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is the Colt Agent. So this was a firearm that was weighed lighter, actually. I believe it weighed lighter than the Colt Cobra, which the first gen was 0.94 pounds, and then the second gen was 1 pound. The Colt Agent was about, I think, 0.88 pounds, maybe 0.87 pounds. So it's quite a bit lighter than the Colt Cobra. And it was introduced in 1955, pretty close to the year of the Python. Like I said, it was designed with a shorter grip frame, and because of that, Colt standardized the Cobra and the Detective Special to also have the shortened grip frame in 1965. So it looks like they let it go. It looks like they actually produced two different grip frames for 10 years, but then in 1965 they went ahead and standardized it. Now the Colt Agent would get an upgrade in, I think, in 1973. At that point, they just added a shrouded ejector rod, and it weighed 1 pound. So that must have been a pretty heavy ejector rod shroud, because the Colt Cobra's unshrouded was 0.94, and then the shrouded was 1 pound. So wow, that's a heavy ejector rod shroud. And then it would get another update in 1982, and that had a parkerized finish, but I think that was it. That was the only difference. And the Colt Agent went into production until 1986, and then it wasn't produced anymore after that. Well, that's all I wanted to talk about in today's video. Just Colt D-frame snubbies. Like I said, if I just talked about this guy, it'd be a 10-second video. So I hope that was interesting for you. I like to go into the history of it. Now, as I've mentioned before, next video, I'm going to talk about Colt's new revolver line. Their new Colt Cobra, new King Cobra, new Python, and then new Anaconda. Again, it's going to be a fun time. As you can probably imagine, I'm not too much of a fan of it, but I also didn't buy anything for the new revolver line, so try to be fair as much as I can. I hope this video was entertaining for you guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.